So I would like to introduce our last presenter. Emily Sahakian is Associate Professor in the Department of Theatre, Film Studies and Romance Languages at the University of Georgia. In addition to many chapters on cultural politics, performance, race and gender in the Francophone world, she is the author of Staging Creolization, Women's Theatre and Performance from the French Caribbean, published with the University of Virginia Press in 2017, and of course with Andrew Daly from the University of Memphis of the critical edition and of History from the Abyss, the critical edition and translation of Tale of Black Histories, which will be published with Caribbean Studies Press. And we have to thank both of you for today's roundtable and tonight's performance.
Thank you, Sandrine. So in my remarks, I'd like to reflect on Glissant's interest in and practice of theater, and ask how theater was a way for Glissant to do history differently, to paraphrase the conference theme. Though he's better known for his novels, poetry, and theoretical writings, Glissant was quite interested in theater as a medium of cultural production, particularly in the time from the late 1950s. So the late 1950s is when he saw Jean-Marie Serrault's production of Kateb Yassine's tragedy of Algeria's struggles for independence. And it's also the time that he began writing his play Monsieur Toussaint, to the mid-1970s. And the mid-1970s is when Monsieur Toussaint was finally staged. And then after having mounted 4 productions with an outreach theater group that he created as part of the Institut Martiniquais d'études, at that time Glissant stalled in giving the actors pieces of the script in progress. And because the actors didn't receive the script in a timely manner, the theater group disbanded. So though Glissant's interest in theater waned, the concepts of embodied performance, corporeal experience, and storytelling as keys to understanding Caribbean culture and epistemologies endured. One important trace, and perhaps I think the most compelling trace of Glissant's theatrical practice that we have is the little-known play Histoire de Nègre, which Andy and I have translated as Tale of Black Histories. The play, which was collectively created under Glissant's direction by the Institute's theater group, comprised of school teachers who had little prior theater experience, exemplifies Glissant's investment in dialogic, collective learning, as well as community-based participatory knowledge, and the project of decentering the author. Furthermore, it shows us in action the mechanisms of creolization and the construction of a Caribbean historical consciousness from non-history or disjointed fragments of memory, all ideas that Glissant was elaborating at that time. Indeed, the ideas put together in Discours Entier were certainly informed by, definitely in dialogue, and perhaps based in Glissant's activities as an educator and theater artist at the Institute. So a little bit of a background on the play, but I'll try to go quickly here. As you know, at the time of this play's creation in 1971, public schools in Martinique followed the standard French curriculum, teaching Caribbean pupils that their ancestors were the blonde, blue-eyed Gauls. Glissant's Institute, in contrast, sought to teach Martinicans Caribbean, Black diasporic, and post-colonial histories and literatures in order to instill what Glissant called the science of the self. The theater group took this project outside of the classroom. They offered up historical documents and literary texts that were reframed, remixed, and transformed by the play, and they drew from different performance traditions and combined and creolized these multiple influences under a theatrical form meant to encourage participation, dialogue, and dissent from its popular audience. The play rejected colonial accounts of history and the possibility of any single authoritative master narrative of history, and instead used folktale conventions to tell multiple reverberating stories of colonial violence and resistance that span cultures, languages, and chronological time. Designed to be interactive, it invited audiences to respond to and participate in the collective act of history telling or history enacting. So the play is an illustration of Glissant's wish for consciousness-raising theater. In his essay Théâtre Conscience du Peuple, which was first published in Acoma as the group was performing the play in 1971 and actually first presented a few years earlier. In it, Glissant wrote that theater can establish a shared historical consciousness by inviting its spectators to reflect on their shared national experiences, rituals, and folklore. He believed that Martinicans did not share a historical consciousness and were in fact alienated from their own culture and history. He wished for a Caribbean theater that would put Caribbean folklore and traditions on stage and invite audiences to reflect upon them critically. He also believed that theater could help Martinicans become reacquainted, renouer, with the past by renewing links to their alienated culture and history, or really remaking this alienated culture and history through fragments. Improvisation, collaboration, and dialogue enabled the theater group and their audiences to renew acquaintance and to reconstruct this creolized form of knowledge. This was not a didactic project, but rather a dialogic one that involved criticism, contradiction, and messiness. So Histoire des Nègres puts the process of creolization on stage as it melds, juxtaposes, and puts into dialogue different performance traditions. We can recognize a characteristically Brechtian use of projections and other meta-theatrical techniques like minimalist scenery, symbolic costume pieces, and these were probably influenced by Glissant's viewing of Jean-Marie Serrault's production of Kateb Yassin's play. These Brechtian techniques awaken the spectators to the fact that history is created and maintained by humans, and therefore teach that humans can alter history. Yet many of these same elements could be attributed to Caribbean folklore performance practices. The actors who easily transform themselves from one character to another are like the mots-foisés of Caribbean folklore, masters of metamorphosis commonly known to transform themselves into dogs. One might even see the actors as devotees who are mounted as in a Haitian voodoo ritual by different loa. Indeed, the play names and honors tragic revolutionary historical figures, the dead, who are more living than the living. And the mythic figure who asks questions of the audience and comments on the action acts as a storyteller. In this case, the alienated Brechtian spectator is also an active one, participating through such techniques as call and response, as one does during a storytelling evening. So formally, this intermixing of overlapping performance traditions represents knowledge of Black history, Histoire du Nègre, in multiple modes that cannot be clearly untangled. For example, the history of Ali Ker, the murdered Martinican activist, is told three ways: by means of a familiar folk song, lines poetically telling his story, and a projection showing his body tied to a metal sheet. In Martinican Creole, the actors sing Ali Ker, from the day they took you, the sea refused to be complicit. It brought your body back to us so that we could sing your name. Performance as a repertoire of knowledge regarding the past renews the meanings of the folk song and reacquaints the actors and spectators with the story of Ali Ker in a disjointed way. To organize this abundance of syncretic material, the group divided the play into three parts. As Glissant explains in his preface, the play shows three moments in Black history. One, slavery. Two, the struggles for liberation, independence, and civil rights. And the capitalists are important characters in that section. And three, neocolonialism with its attempts at brainwashing, which shows the neo-feudal consumer society without production in a comic way that Nick just talked about. The play's structure mimics the folktale tradition. Black history is here told as a transmutable tale. Will the circumstances of oppression and the struggle for liberation change across time and space? The core remains the same. Theater enabled the group to tell this history across time, or perhaps more accurately, in a space of coexisting temporalities, from which the Black experience emerges within and across time. In his preface to the play Mr. Toussaint, Glissant explained that theater should offer a prophetic vision of the past, that is, an engagement with the past, unfolding in the present, and looking toward the future. By inhabiting these coexisting temporalities, Histoire de Nègre does so, and it fosters historical consciousness by inviting the spectator to participate in the creative, collective act of meaning-making from these historical fragments it stages. It offers a public history that is, to paraphrase Pierre Singaravello's keynote that we heard yesterday, experiential, practiced, collective, participatory, and pluridisciplinary, not reflecting a vertical top-down dissemination of knowledge, but rather a horizontal co-creation of knowledge. Thanks.
So, thank you very much for this, and we have some time for questions. If there are comments from the audience, if there are any.
Hi, so thank you. This was really interesting and productive and made me think about a lot of things I haven't thought together in quite a while. But partly for that reason, I think the disciplinary historian in me has this sort of reflex, which is to ask, aside from Glissant thinking in similar ways to Heidegger or Badiou or Deleuze or these other people, do we have a sense of like who he's reading or his influences? So I certainly see the influence through Khatab Yassine, what Yassine is doing. But do we have a sense of whether or not there's a similarity because it's inherent to a sort of poetics of thinking through these things? And so when you're thinking about political issues on a global scale poetically, Heidegger is an automatic point of reference. Or is it a structural thing about what's happening with the world and rethinking Marxism in the 60s and the 70s? And so therefore, it really makes sense to put him in dialogue with Balibar and Rancière and Badiou and Althusser because they're all thinking about similar questions and at that time period. I guess that's a question that sort of hovers over everybody with no particular person.
Thank you, Scott. Does anybody else want to ask a question? I'd just like to add another one so we can wrap up. Thank you. So while John and Nick talked about Glissant as a thinker, so I want to pick up from Scott. I'm interested to hear from Emily and Andrew about the very process of translating and then explaining a play that relied so much on improvisation, so much so that the actors disbanded, that is so dialogic, and that is really about knowledge production in the moment, and as well as being a reflection on history.
The first question first, or?
Did you hear the question, Nick, about sources and history? And
I did.
Okay.
Why don't you go ahead, John?
No, I was going to say, why don't you, in case the internet cuts out.
Okay. I'll go first. I think that's a great question, and I tried, hopefully, I was able along the way to point to the many places where Glissant, as we know, is constantly inventing his own concepts. Dispossession was one that was key for me and what I was just referring to. But in terms of influences and theoretical influences, in this case of what he was reading and all, perhaps John has things to add. We know, of course, that he was reading Deleuze and Guattari closely and citing them repeatedly. But in my presentation, I simply was trying to take the evidence of what I was seeing terminologically of the way that he's framing his argument about critique, historicity, transition, and Martinican political economy. And I, without him necessarily ever citing or footnoting Marx or Balibar or whoever it might be, I think you're right. If I heard the question properly, I think you're right that this was the theoretical atmosphere of the 60s and 70s in France, and the way of thinking through these problems of transition, and so where Glissant's problem became the transition out of neo-colonialism into some form from heteronomy to autonomy, however that might be formulated. I think that the tools of thought that he was drawing on, among many different ones in this period, necessarily had to be those of Marx and of Althusser's dominant structural critique and reading capitalism. And so having that so familiar, I think I'm sort of seeing it everywhere, but hopefully I'm not just under my own illusion. But I think I hopefully can make the case that you're exactly right, that it's drawn from the theoretical discourse of that period, and then he takes it in very different directions and gives it his own conceptuality and his own peripheral terms.
Thank you, Nick.
So I actually can say something on that. Scott's question is, I'll play the historian and look at it institutionally, which is that, Glissant, like so many French thinkers, is notorious for not citing what he's actually reading, right? And I'm hoping the next time I'm in Paris to have Sylvie Glissant let me go through his library just to see at least what was in it. But we do know we can trace through his biography, and of course, biography is not the same as thought. Context is not the same as text. But, his professors at the Sorbonne were Gaston Bachelard and Jean Val. Bachelard is a phenomenologist. Val, who of course is maybe the first major popularizer of Heidegger in France. So it's clearly, he comes and is trained out of a Heideggerian tradition of phenomenological philosophy. Also, we know that he was, close socially, intellectually, and institutionally with the Argument group, right, with people like Kostas Axelos, François Châtelet, Pierre Fougarolas, people who are trying to hybridize Marx and Heidegger. So if I think that's sort of what Nick and John have been able to do, is pull on two threads in Glissant's thinking, the Marxian and the Heideggerian aspects of that thought. So, and I think he is close to these intellectuals who are trying to sort of synthesize those two thinkers. In terms of some sort of other questions as well, if you go back and look at Akoma, the journal which he was working on in the late 60s, early 70s, some of his collaborators on that journal, André Lucrèce, Michel Giraud, Lucrèce had studied with Althusser in Paris. He cites Althusser in some of his essays for the collection. Giraud, he described himself to me as an anarchist, but it's quite clear that he is working out of a particular sort of Marxian tradition. So I think, again, Glissant doesn't cite this stuff in his writing, because that's not the kind of writing he's doing, but I think you can trace back institutionally, socially, where he's at, where the positions he is in these social networks of intellectuals, and you can see this particularly this Heideggerian and Marxian legacy in his thought.
Would you like to say something about the play?
I would like to address the second question. So first, just a clarification, the group disbanded when they were working on a different play. So Histoire de Nègre was the first play that they worked on, and then they did 3 others, the last one being a montage that they performed at the Carafesta Festival. And they were working on a play that Glissant was writing, that he did finish, Parabole d'un Moulin de Martinique, but he didn't finish it on time, and he gave them the pieces of the script so slowly that they disbanded. But yes, that's a very important question. How do we translate this play that wasn't really meant to be a play published as a script? As a matter of fact, when it's published in Akoma, it really is a trace of this theatrical activity, a documentation of the theatrical activity, because we see it in this space of coexisting temporalities. We want to translate it and present it in a way that will equip future artists, teachers, historians to restage it. And so the translation is not only a linguistic translation, but also a lot of work with annotation and notes. And then because we've been working also with artists to stage it, we're thinking about staging considerations, and we are writing those in as well. And in the introduction, there will be a note not only about the stagings that we've done, but looking ahead toward future stagings. I think that because this is a play that deals with knowledge and runs on improvisation, it really does invite new recreations that could be different. And that is kind of something that I think most playwrights do accept, although sometimes they don't. Sometimes they say you can't produce it unless you follow these exact instructions. But I think that some playwrights do know that their play is going to be reimagined, and accept that their play is going to be reimagined by the artists that take it on, and we are very open to that, so much so that we could even imagine a troupe adding a fourth part that spoke to these issues in their own local context, which I think would be in the spirit of the project of this play.
That makes for a very exciting performance, and for what you will have stage for us. And Glissant appears in your forthcoming book, Andrew, because I didn't have a chance to introduce you. And I think we should know that you talk about Glissant in After Négritude, Anti-Colonial Activism in Post-War France. That's coming out with Nebraska University Press. Any last, I think we just
John.
have a few minutes.
I just have a quick comment on the on the first question. I mean, what both Andrew and Nick said, I think covers most of what I would say. And for me, there's sort of three parts to that, to response to that question. One is a question of citation and influence, which they've spoken to, and Deleuze and Guattari, of course, dominant figures in that. But you can also read, in Poetics of Relation, all this talk about being and beings, sort of in the other, seems to be alluding to sort of Heideggerian, Derridian, Levinasian motifs, perhaps. There is also, for me, the spirit of the moment, that the mid-century and after is a time of sustained crisis around disaster and catastrophe. And I think that Glissant is part of that tradition, whether or not you make these, whether or not he's reading this or reading that or footnoting and citing, that for me is another question. I'm not trying to downplay that question. But I think for me, ultimately, and I try to not take up time in a short presentation with confessional, but for me, something like framing this juxtaposition, because it was supposed to be a juxtaposition, I know it was very short, with Heidegger, and so not that he's a Heideggerian, right, but a juxtaposition with the Heideggerian motif of Erasmus, for me is a kind of hermeneutical honesty. It's like, how am I coming to this moment in Glissant's work? Is it, Césaire? Is it Fanon? Is it George Lamming? Is it, Benjamin Adorno? I mean, these are things in my book. And here, I think about the event through Heidegger, not Badiou. And so for me, it's as much about my position as a reader. And that's a fraught moment, and I say I avoid confessional in this case. I always think a confessional is actually a really good thing, especially when you're crossing language, linguistic, national, and racial boundaries. And for me, the sort of Heideggerian frame is this hermeneutic honesty, that I don't want to drop this notion of event as if I'm developing it straight out of Glissant, but instead be honest. And that's also the sort of decadence of a pure theorist, which I am. And so when you say disciplinary historian, I'm in the department of almost all historians, and I drive them insane as an unapologetic theorist. But for me, part of being an unapologetic theorist who's also responsible is being upfront about the terms of interpretation.
Thank you, and thank you for the. I have to
Please
stand in front of the camera. I just want to thank all of you. Do you have any last thoughts about the play? I think this has been a demonstration of interdisciplinary production, which is not surprising, around Gleason. So.
And I'll just mention, unfortunately, that our other colleague, Haneta Vété-Congolo, was not able to make it, and her contribution is missed. So, thank you, Sandrine.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Andy.